All right, so this is a quick video on good summaries, and hopefully you have actually already read through the examples that I'm just going to cover and thought to yourself how they meet the guidelines for good summaries, how strong they are or not strong they are, and what they could do to be improved. So please do that on your own before you listen to this video. And you can sort of check your experience against what I'm saying. So it says here, use the following guidelines for good summaries to evaluate the examples below. In other words, how well do each of the summary paragraphs follow the guidelines, and how much of the main idea in the text, in other words, in Talk to an Iraqi or in The Real Rosa Parks, did they get right or wrong? I'm going to use the readings that we did from week 2. So your summary should be able to stand alone, and I have some instructions here for what I want the first line to say. Those are suggestions. Use the author's last name throughout, and of course when you don't have an author's last name, you have to figure out a different way to do that. You might say the video Talk to an Iraqi discusses blah, 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 or you might say the producer's name. So it was This American Life that produced that video, and so you might use the producer's name. You should use your own words as much as possible and avoid quoting too much. In good summaries, you should use brief sentences with transitional phrases. And you should guide your reader with significance words, like what should I be focusing on? Basically, importantly, main point, conclusion. And then maintain the focus and tone of the original piece. And I agree that this is not as clear as it should be. What that means is that I don't want actually your opinion in the summary. I think that's pretty much standard practice. If you read a movie review, you're going to get a brief synopsis of what happens in the movie before you get an opinion about how good the movie is. So if you look at movie synopses, that's usually how it is. Usually broken out into separate paragraphs, sometimes not, to distinguish between what actually occurs in the text or in the video from your opinion or your response to the video. Those are different things. Summary should be objective. And then you're going to exclude narrations like, next I'm going to tell you about, or I thought the main point was. Here are some of your submissions from The Real Rosa Parks. And again, my intention is that you have already read through these and thought a little bit about what's stronger and what's not. I've put them here anonymously from among all of you. Okay, in Paul Loeb's The Real Rosa Parks, the idea of heroes is addressed. Loeb brings Rosa Parks into this article to provide credibility and a feel for what was going on in her head. Okay, we're getting close. We know a little bit about what this article is about. Giving some background on Rosa Parks, and also doing that first thing that I asked, which is to introduce, the paragraph should stand alone, meaning that it should introduce the title and author of the piece in the very first line. Very nicely done. There are some things that get confusing though. The student writes, Parks talked about how she wasn't born into a title that would later make her into the public figure she is today. And I went back and looked at the reading to see if Paul Loeb had used this term, and I couldn't find it. So I think this maybe needed a revision for clarity. What exactly is the student trying to get at here? And then the student also writes, this article is written to provide motivation to people who feel they aren't that good, aren't good enough to have a say. Fantastic. You're thinking about audience. You're making guesses about who this is written for. That's great. And that's beyond the guidelines for good summaries, but it's a very good thing to do. You'll notice the summary is shorter than the others we'll look at, and that actually is a problem. There isn't enough here for me to truly understand Paul Loeb's point about Rosa Parks being painted as someone who acted alone, but in fact did not. So let's see if example 2 does that better. This article by Paul Loeb, The Real Rosa Parks, did interest me since there were a few facts that I didn't know. Okay, so one of the things that I'm asking you to do in the guidelines for good summaries is to maintain the focus and tone of the original piece. Telling me that you learned some new things is great, but it does not actually belong in a summary. Like I was saying about movie reviews, what happened in the film or what happened in the text should be separate from your response or your opinion about it, even if it's a good opinion, like it was interesting to me. Please leave that out. Put that later in your response. Okay, stick right to what Paul Loeb is saying. And then this student did a great job using their own words throughout. Here's an example. he emphasized her earlier, this is Paul Loeb now, emphasized Rosa Parks' earlier involvement and showed how younger crowds who, like me, that thought that her act was unanticipated and brave wasn't exactly the case. So the student is sort of struggling with clarity here, but really using their own words to summarize this complicated idea, actually, that Loeb is describing, where Rosa Parks was actually really involved in the civil rights movement prior to the bus boycott, and we just have talked about it not like that. We've simplified quite a bit. So this student is getting closer. Revision for clarity would have been really helpful. And then the student writes the main point at the very end. I don't have to be a courageous woman to stand up and fight for what I believe in. I don't need to have that hero complex. Everyone starts somewhere, and I could do the same, right? So this is sort of getting at what Paul Loeb is saying. Now, the Guidelines for Good Summaries ask for you to use the author's last name throughout the piece, i.e. Loeb discusses, Loeb says, Paul Loeb argues, and so on. So that actually was needed in this last line here. Loeb makes the point that I don't have to be a creative, okay? And then example 3. The Real Rosa Parks, written by Paul Loeb, an American social and political activist, displays the backstory behind Rosa Parks. Loeb states that Rosa Parks was an active member of a social group who wants to create change before she took action in the bus she was in. So this student, I think, maybe might have been in a hurry. This is true, what is highlighted here. But it's also important, I think, in the summary to talk about the NAACP, to mention some of what Paul Loeb says she was actually doing. In other words, to provide some of the examples that Paul Loeb talks about. And then a use of quote, this works fine. Notice how the student does use transitional phrases, like I was asking in the Guidelines for Good Summaries, and does use Loeb's last name. Very nicely done there. And then I think that we are still struggling to understand one of Paul Loeb's main points. So this student concludes, he expressed his concern to Rosa Parks' story was never fully told, but only the event that created a miracle. First part, yeah, we have simplified the story, but actually Paul Loeb says that all social justice change, all social change comes from the result of working together. And so creating a miracle still has this feel that she did it alone. Okay, so just teasing out your language here and thinking about it as you write. Finally, some of your submissions from Talk to an Iraqi. Now this student chose to do this in 2 paragraphs, which is, I'm going to discourage you from doing unless you're talking about a very, very long piece. I want you to keep it really concise. This student had a great focus on the original tone. Remember, that's one of the Guidelines for Good Summaries. Focus keeps the focus on the tone and the focus of the original piece. He says many people that talked to him, meaning Hyder, had fought in the war, had family who had fought in the war. He was somewhat surprised by some of the reactions and responses he received. He found that some people related to him and some disliked him just because he was Iraqi. So very nice job. I'm not saying any of the students' opinion here. I'm simply hearing what happened in the video, how people responded. There were many key points I gathered from the video. This is an example of what we call narrations. So if you look at the Guidelines for Good Summary, it says exclude narrations like I'm going to tell you about. So there were many key points in the video. Just take this line out. Go back and edit these things out and go right into the main point. I am actually not sure what the student means by text. My first text was the old lady. I think the student actually means the word example, because he uses 3 or she uses 3 examples here. So make sure you're editing for these things that are not as clear. And then the student ended by saying, finally, and then there's another example. So usually when you're using the term finally, you're going to wrap up the whole summary and sort of conclude it, tie it in a bow. But the student instead provided another example. So this kind of ends with, she was able to connect with him about being separated from a family since her dad was a Marine. But actually we then need another sentence that concludes this whole summary. And finally, example 2, Talk to an Iraqi tries addressing the questions faced when looking at the ongoing war in Iraq. Very nice job. This is a strong summary in the sense that it starts out very clearly talking about what the text is and then talking about what the main idea is. This was really well done. The student probably needed to do more to use the author's last name because I got confused. He had different expectations for how things were going to go. Rather than him being asked several questions, he was being told all true, and I inferred that you meant Hyder here, but we need something like that, like the main character of this text, or Hyder, or the speaker in the video, something like that to let us know. The student uses quotes well, the student uses transitional phrases. And then there is a little bit of opinion here, I believe his main point, and you actually don't need this because, in fact, what you're saying here is summary. Bring a realization to people's understanding of what's going on in the world. I think he basically says something very close to that in the video itself. So you actually don't need the first part of this sentence. You could just get right to it and say, the point of this video was to help people understand, and so on. Okay, so again, as you are writing about being wrong this week, please look at the guidelines for good summaries, and please get in the habit of rereading your work before you post it for typos, for clarity, for vocabulary, like, did you really mean this? And maybe go back and look at the book again, especially if there's a section that you didn't understand very well before you post, so that what you post can be very clear. All right, thank you.